Well, hello, AP World. Now it's time for the exciting conclusion to Chapter 32. And actually, as I've mentioned many times this chapter, I've spent so much time on it because the significance of what happened during the imperialistic era continues to reverberate to this day. So, first of all, the economic legacies of imperialism. The colonized states, for example, those areas of Africa or India or parts of the Pacific or the Caribbean, were encouraged to exploit their natural resources. In other words, to extract whatever they could or to have crops or extract minerals and resources that would then go to the Europeans or the Americans or the Japanese and would feed into those manufacturing centers. So the natural resources were exploited, but these areas that were colonized themselves did not have the opportunity to develop their own industry. And instead, colonization encouraged dependency on imperial powers for the manufactured goods made from the products that came from their own land. For example, a perfect example of this is Indian cotton. Much of the cotton that was harvested from India went back to England and was made into fine textiles in England. And India itself did not create much of their own textile industry until the 20th century as they began to decolonize. So two really important things to remember on this slide. First of all, those colonized states they extracted and exploited their natural resources, and then as a result, they became dependent on the imperial powers. New crops were introduced into parts of the world and changed really the natural landscape of many of the countries that were colonized. Huge labor migrations occurred, with millions of people flooding to areas that would either feed the industrial centers or that would bring manual laborers to areas to support the colonization process. So you can read more about that in your textbook. Social political legacies. You know what? People didn't just sit back and say, hey, that's okay, go ahead and take my land. In fact, there were thousands of insurrections against colonial rule. We often talk about a handful of them. One of the more notable ones, and I think partially because it is just so tragic, is the Maji Maji Rebellion against the Germans back in Tanganyika in 1905 and 1906. Now, Maji Maji meant magic water, and so what the rebels did is they actually sprinkled themselves with what they believed was to be holy water. It was a mixture of oil and a particular water, and they believed that these bullets would hit the skin that had this Maji Maji water on it, and that the bullets would just dissolve into water themselves, and that they wouldn't be killed. In essence, it was just a suicide mission, because 75,000 of the Tanganyikans were killed, and indeed the bullets were not magic. The Xhosa cattle killing movement is one that your textbook doesn't talk about, but another particularly tragic rebellion in which the Xhosa people, which were in southern Africa, had a vision from this young girl called Nangwasu, and she believed that God was telling her that they should kill all of their cattle. This was a very cattle-rich area, but the Africans, the Xhosa and the Khoisan, had been very brutally oppressed by the British and by the Dutch, and so out of desperation, they listened to this 14-year-old girl's prophecy to kill their cattle. And then when the cattle were all killed, the prophecy was that the white man would leave and all the black men that had died would arise again. Well, she even had a date set aside for this, and as the Xhosa people went along with killing the cattle, the date passed for the Great Rising, and the whites did not disappear, and in fact 20,000 African people died of starvation because of the cattle killing. And then they ended up having to really beg to go to the places of the white rulers that were there. The Battle of Ottawa in Ethiopia in 1889 was the only successful rebellion, and you can read more about that one in your textbook, but just keep in mind that this battle was against the Italians Ethiopia did remain unoccupied. However, the Italians would come back later into Ethiopia seeking revenge in the 20th century. Another social legacy of the imperial era and colonization is the concept of scientific racism. So Count Joseph Arthur de Gobineau produced an essay on the inequality of the human races. In it, he argued that race was the most important index of human potential, and in fact, he identified racial categories based on physical differences. So if you would look at his essay, you would see that they did things like they measured brow width and brow to nose ratios and eye width, size of eyes, size of cheeks, and so many measurements were made of people's facial features, as well as their bodies, their height, their stature, and he created a whole system of categorization that placed some races as superior to others. Now, this picture you can see here is actually called Principal Varieties of Mankind. On the top, we have the Asians. These are all Asiatic peoples. And by the way, as the heading says down here, or the footer, these were the views that this particular artist had and the Europeans had of what these people groups looked like. So we have the Asiatics here. We have the Australians here. We, of course, have the Europeans in the center. We have the Polynesians. We have the Africans here. And then we have the Americans here. And the theories of Charles Darwin were combined with the theories of scientific racism to form the doctrine of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism would become the foundation of a whole movement called eugenics. So people like Spearman, who was a professor at Stanford, and Charles Galton would put together this American Eugenics Society, and in it they called for selective breeding and for forced sterilization. For people who study psychology, the legacy of Spearman is really quite sad, because Spearman, he was a brilliant man who studied intelligence, and in fact, he came up with the concept of IQ. So whenever you hear that term IQ, you think of someone's intelligence. Well, the reason why he came up with that notion of IQ, along with Galton, was to promote the ideas of eugenics and to promote forced sterilization and selective breeding in order to speed up evolution. This natural outcome of this would be the genocides of the 20th century, in which certain groups of people were marginalized, whether they be handicapped or Jewish or of African descent or whatever the case may be. These genocides were a natural outcome of social Darwinism, scientific racism, and eugenics. Rising out of the imperialism and colonization, however, did come both nationalism of the colonized nations and anti-colonial movements. Now, these will begin in the 19th century, but they will come to fruition in the 20th century. Ram Mohan Roy, this is a statue of him, was a Bengali man who is called the father of modern India. He and a group of reformers called for self-government, adoption of selective British practices such as the ban on sati, which is the wife placing herself on the funeral pyre. They promoted Hindu practices, and often these reformers were educated in universities and understood and held Enlightenment values, and did not really see a consistency between British rule and the Enlightenment values. And so they brought their education back into India and began these anti-colonial movements. The Indian National Congress formed in 1885. In 1916, it joined with the All India Muslim League. And so the Muslims and Hindus were working together for a period of time. They gained a right to local elected assemblies, and the anti-colonial movements, not only in India but across Africa, expand widely in the 20th century, with decolonization occurring at a rapid pace, and we'll learn about that in our next unit. So the final word on all of this, all of what we've been talking about this week. There was a massive power shift that began in earlier centuries as the Europeans took to the waters. And this power shift and world hegemony expands for Europe, the USA, and Japan in the 19th century and into the 20th century. Europe would gain massive land holdings. The USA and Japan would protect massive business interests and would industrialize rapidly. Arbitrary borders that were created by imperialism and oppression of colonized people will lead to numerous 20th century conflicts and genocides. And finally, racism became entrenched into world politics, into world societies throughout the 20th century, and would mark relationships between people groups throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. So as I said before, I am very passionate about this chapter in your text and have gone into great detail on it because it really did set the stage for where the world is at today. I can't even imagine really what the world would be like had the colonization not have occurred. But the point is, it did occur, and this is what led to the conflicts of the 20th century, which was the deadliest century in the history of the world. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for all your attention. You're awesome students, and have a wonderful night. Good night.